When the veteran and his dog delved into the freezing earth, they chuckled. But as the whole valley started to freeze to death, nobody was laughing. The town made fun of Luke Harrison and his devoted dog Ranger for creating an insane underground refuge during the harsh Montana winter. However, one secret cave beneath a barn became the sole warm spot for miles as temperatures dropped and houses turned to ice, and the truth no one. At last, what was anticipated surfaced. Even though the calendar still said it was early September, the wind slashed over the wide Montana plain like a chilly knife, bringing with it the sharp smell of pine and winter. Luke Harrison returned to the loose board under his boots after pausing long enough to press his flannel collar closer to his neck. Long before he purchased the land, the old barn had stood here for decades, and each beam, nail, and plank appeared to carry a recollection that wasn't his. That didn't bother him. Living with a stranger's ghosts was somehow simpler than dealing with the ones he had returned from 12 years of military service. On most days, the terrain was calm, predictable, and serene. Beside him, Ranger padded. The German shepherd's gaze scanned the darkness as though the barn were another battlefield to protect, and his ears perked up. Luke chuckled to himself. Relax. Ranger didn't calm down though. Buddy, it's just rotten wood, not a perimeter breach. His muscles tensed as he scented the air and let forth a loud, low growl. Luke, hammer in hand, crouched next to the damaged corner. After years of damp hay lying on it, the plank he intended to replace was mushy and as thin as paper. Prepared to remove the old board, he set the new one aside. Before he could push the hammer's claw under it, Ranger sprang forward. Luke was startled back onto one knee by the loud and harsh barking that reverberated off the barn walls. Ranger's paws scraped the board as if he were trying to extract something. Something hazardous. Something living. Whoa. Hello? Luke reached for the dog's harness, but Ranger wouldn't move. Luke had only heard his bark twice before, but now it was in a frenetic, hurried cadence. Once during a night raid overseas, and once, in enemy territory, Ranger prevented him from stepping upon a buried pit trap. Luke's heart raced at the sound. "What is it, Ranger?" he muttered. The dog threw himself forward. The old plank broke. The whole section of flooring collapsed under Luke before he could straighten up straight. His left boot fell to the ground and was engulfed by empty space up to his knee. Splintered wood grazed his shin as he gasped and grasped. He was on the nearby boards, gasping for air. The only sound for a little while was the panting of the Rangers. With his heart pounding in his chest, Luke steadied himself. He carefully released his leg and slid back onto the firm floor. He grabbed his belt-mounted flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it in the direction of the sharp aperture. Something was seen when the laser penetrated the darkness and dust. Impossible. There wasn't loose dirt, an animal den that had collapsed, or the remains of an old root cellar beneath him. No, this was a room. A deep, rectangular chamber that was about 10 feet long and almost as wide. Packed dirt was used to create smooth walls that were supported by wooden beams. There was also no muck on the floor down there. It was hard, somewhat polished-like. Someone had lived or worked in the space for years. Luke blinked vigorously, wondering whether his mind was automatically filling in the details. Weapon stashes, tunnels, and hiding places. Those were from a different life. However, this was not a delusion. This was actual. He lowered the torch through the gap. A tiny iron stove nestled in the far left corner became visible as the shadows moved and lifted. Its mouth is square. The handle was still in place, and it was closed, perfectly hidden within the outside wall structure of the barn above it. A vent pipe vanished into the boards. Luke would never have noticed it if he hadn't seen it from below. This was intentionally constructed by someone. It was concealed and used long enough for someone to construct a stove, conceal the vent, and make sure nobody ever found out. Luke felt a shiver run up his spine, not from the Montana wind, but from the silence. From the shadows, truth was staring back at him. Deep secrets resided here. He put down the flashlight, leaned in, and attempted to control his breathing. Ranger hovered next to him, his pupils wide with concentration, his ears pricked and his tail rigid. Something caught the dog's attention. Beneath their feet for an unknown number of decades could lie danger, a presence, or simply the unknown. Luke inhaled deeply. "Well, Ranger," he whispered, "looks like this place has a story we didn't pay for." The dog whimpered softly, nudging Luke's elbow to take action. But even Ranger dared not approach the broken edge. Luke swallowed hard and gazed into the secret chamber below, experiencing a familiar rush of adrenaline that he wished he had left behind on foreign soil. "Let's find out what's down there," he whispered. Ranger didn't bark this time. Instead, he just stood guard at Luke's side, steady and silent as the wind outside shifted. Whatever this place was, it wasn't part of the listing, and it certainly wasn't normal. But something in his gut, something old, instinctive, and military, told him this discovery wasn't an accident. It was the beginning. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam of his flashlight, like tiny ghosts rising from their long slumber. And Rangers sniffed the air again, every one of them carrying the first whisper of winter through the barn's cracks. Luke eased himself closer to the edge of the broken floor, brushing aside splintered wood and stray hay. The hole yawned wider now that the board had collapsed, revealing more of the chamber below. With muscles in his body tight, his instinct was sharper than any weapon Luke had ever carried. Luke steadied the flashlight in his left hand and tested the edge of the floor with his right. It held, but just barely. A few more inches and he would have crashed straight through when the board gave way earlier. He exhaled slowly, thanking whatever luck he still had left. "Could have broken my neck," he muttered under his breath. "Breathe." He angled the flashlight deeper into the chamber. The walls weren't rough or sloppy the way an animal burrow would be. They were carefully shaped and reinforced with layers of sawed bricks packed tightly with clay. Wooden beams, weathered but still solid, spanned across the ceiling, supporting the barn floor above. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. This wasn't improvisation. This was craftsmanship. A faint chill rolled up from the chamber, but it wasn't the damp cold Luke expected from a buried room. Instead, it felt dry, almost preserved, like the air hadn't shifted in years. He spotted a small ladder in the shadows leaning against the dirt wall. Its rungs were dusty but intact. "Well, that's convenient," he murmured. He tugged at it from above to test its strength. The wood creaked, but it didn't crumble. He slipped his flashlight into his mouth, gripping it between his teeth, and lowered himself down, rung by rung. Ranger hovered at the edge, ears turning with every creak, as if ready to leap in after him if anything happened. When Luke's boots hit the packed dirt floor, a hollow thump echoed in the space around him. He lifted the flashlight. The chamber stretched out clearly now, about 10 by 8 ft. The ceiling only a little above his head. The dirt walls held firm, smooth from deliberate. He approached the small iron stove, which was about a third the size of a typical one, squat and heavy. He felt the handle, and it moved smoothly, too smoothly for something that had been neglected for decades. Someone must have oiled it, or at least used it long enough for the metal to. Above him, Ranger gave a single, cautious bark. "I'm fine," Luke called up softly. "Just looking." He then turned and swept the beam across the room once more, finding an overturned crate in the far corner, which he nudged upright with his boot. It was empty, as was another crate leaning against the wall, which was also empty, but next to it was a flattened piece of stiff, old cloth that might have been someone's last attempt at solace in this hidden. Luke crouched and picked it up, and even though it cracked at the seams and shed tiny flakes of dried fabric, he ran his fingers along it, trying to imagine who had once slept here, and why they had chosen the earth over a bed above ground. He had personally witnessed both fear and survival, and he felt his stomach tighten. Locations like this triggered her. He shook the thought away, thinking that whoever had built this must have been desperate. He traced the pipe that connected to the stove, which ran straight upward. It was a unique kind of memory that he didn't want to revisit. Nights spent in makeshift shelters far from base, air so cold it felt like knives, darkness thick as tar, every sound louder than it should be, and every breath an awareness of danger. Through the earth, disappearing into the barn's outer wall, camouflaged perfectly as a standard ventilation slat. A clever trick. No one would ever think smoke was coming from beneath the building. No one would suspect anything at all. Luke stepped back and studied the room again, assessing it the same way he assessed structures in the field. Entries, exits, ventilation, possible cave-ins. The place was sturdy, warmable, hidden, usable. His mind started turning without permission, calculating possibilities. Montana winters were brutal. The farmhouse's insulation was older than he was, and the heater barely worked. Firewood prices had doubled since last year, and he didn't have the savings to cover a full season's worth. This room, this little pocket under the barn, might be nothing more than a relic someone forgot to bury. But with some work, it could be a lifeline. Ranger barked again, sharper this time. Luke glanced up. "I'm coming." He climbed back up the ladder and hauled himself through the opening. Ranger immediately pressed against him, sniffing his jacket and hands like confirming he was intact. Luke rubbed the dog's head. "He saved my hide again, pal." He stood and stared at the broken plank, the dark hole yawning beneath it. A cold wind seeped through the barn's walls, whispering winters. Ranger looked back at Luke, tail low but steady, eyes bright with instinctive understanding. "This wasn't just some accident," Luke murmured. "You found something you were meant to find." Ranger responded with a quiet whine. Warning, snow hadn't arrived yet, but the temperature had dropped enough that every breath felt like an announcement. Time is running out. Brushing his head against Luke's knee, Luke exhaled slowly as he thought about the bills piled on the kitchen table, the failing heater, the thin woodpile behind the house, and the long nights that would soon descend across the valley. This dugout, this forgotten room, held answers he didn't know he needed, and for the first time since leaving the service, he felt guided rather than unlucky. "Come on," he said softly. "We have a..." There was a lot of work to be done. Ranger followed him out of the barn as the last of the day's light faded into the chilly Montana dusk, and the secret chamber beneath the earth waited silently, ready to change their winter before it even started. The next morning, a pale sun barely warmed the frost clinging to the fence posts, and Luke stepped out onto the porch, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He hadn't slept well, and his mind kept replaying the image of that dugout beneath the barn. Those clean lines in the dirt walls, the stovepipe threaded with purpose. The eerie sense that someone had put their whole winter survival into that space. Whoever they were, they understood the cold. And they understood hiding from it. Ranger nudged the door with his nose, tail wagging low. "You want to go with me?" Luke inquired. Ranger responded with a brief, piercing bark, his own take on a strong "yes." Luke grabbed his coat, slid his gloves into his pocket, and locked the cabin door behind him. They headed toward town, a 15-minute drive on a road that wound through open fields of brittle grass. Snow still hadn't arrived, but the world felt frozen in anticipation. Winter was stretching its fingers. Luke parked outside Jensen's general store, The only place in a 20 mi radius where you could buy anything from nails to canned beans. He opened the truck door and stepped out, the cold biting through his jeans. Ranger hopped down beside him, sniffing the air with alert curiosity. Inside, the store was warm. The kind of warm that felt like stepping into someone's living room. A few locals stood near the counter, coffees in hand, voices low in the morning quiet. Luke grabbed 2 small bundles of firewood. Nothing more than what he required for the next couple of days. Money was tight. Every dollar mattered. He carried the bundles to the counter and laid them down. The bell above the entrance jingled behind him as someone walked in. "Well, would you look at that?" Luke didn't have to look back to see who it was. Evan Mills, Harrison, purchasing enough wood to roast a marshmallow, and counting on a comfortable December. He was broad-shouldered, heavy-handed, and loud enough to shake the dust off the store rafters. Rangers instantly tensed up, staring at Evan, while Luke maintained a steady tone. "Good morning, Evan." Evan grinned smugly and repeated, "Morning," walking next to him. "When the snow arrives, I hope that small stack of sticks will be sufficient to keep you warm. According to the forecast, this winter will be harsh." The other men laughed. "It's not crude. It's just like when someone from a tiny town walks through the front door to see entertainment." Evan rested his elbow on the worktop. "Harrison, people in this area typically stock up on wood cords rather than kindling." Luke experienced the well-known constriction in his chest that he had spent years learning to breathe through. Crowds behind him bothered him. Disliked loud voices. Didn't like being the point of. Attention he didn't ask for. Ranger moved in closer, gently caressing his calf to reassure him. Luke muttered, "I'll manage." Evan sneered. "Yes, you will. That dog most likely requires more heat than what you purchased." He gave Ranger a nod. The shepherd's gaze was unwavering, yet he did not snarl. An individual who had never been in the dirt with him was being assessed by a soldier dog. The bundles were raised onto Luke's arm. "We're fine." Evan arched an eyebrow. "When your pipes broke and you were chiseling ice out of your own sink, don't claim that we didn't warn you." More chuckles. Luke gave the cashier a kind gesture, paid, and made his way to the door. At his side, the ranger paced silently. Everyone's eyes were on his back. Felt the well-known sting of criticism, a sting he had endured in one form or another since coming home. Most people had good intentions. Of them, however, people like Evan had no idea what it was like to rebuild your life in silence, piece by piece, and without asking for anything. The cashier whispered, "Don't take it personal," as Luke scooped up his change. "Evan speaks more than he considers." Luke smiled a little. "I've observed." Once more, he ventured outside into the chill. With a slight thud of his tail against the seat, Ranger sprang into the truck. "Luke." He placed the wood in the passenger footwell and briefly placed his hands on the driving wheel. He said, "Don't let it get to you." Not sure if he was addressing the dog or himself. Ranger reminded him he wasn't alone by nudging his shoulder in the same manner he'd done in mountain outposts and desert tents. Luke's thoughts replayed the looks, the warnings, and the mocking laughter as they drove home. Already, the town believed he was unprepared. If he let words slip. About the dugout, about the mysterious room buried beneath his barn. They'd have a field day with him, an insane soldier who lives underground. Bunker boy with PTSD. Overseas, he had heard worse. Here, however, the pain originated in a more private area of his being that he seldom shared with others. Eager to gallop across the yard, Ranger leaped out first when he pulled back into his property. Luke went outside more slowly and looked at the barn. The dugout was there, waiting. Untouched for an unknown amount of time, beneath the floorboards, it seemed to have been waiting for the perfect person. "Let them laugh," he whispered. "We'll figure this out." The wind, which was now colder than before the sun had risen, picked up once again. Luke saw winter encroaching on the valley's boundaries, conveying a warning that only he seemed to hear. He glanced down at the 2 wood bundles he was holding. It wouldn't be sufficient, not even near. However, the dugout may alter. That if he was this astute. If he remained silent. If nobody discovered it before he was prepared. With a gentle wag of his tail and trusting gaze, Ranger trotted back to his side. Luke put his hand on the dog's head by reaching down. "We'll manage," he said again. However, the words didn't feel obstinate this time. They seemed to be a pledge. A pledge based on what Ranger had discovered the previous evening rather than on what he had purchased that morning. A secret chamber. A lost secret. And perhaps an unexpected means of surviving the winter. For the remainder of the day, the thought trailed Luke like a shadow. His gaze kept returning to the barn as he stacked the little bundles of firewood next to the porch, lured to the secret aperture beneath the old boards. The air seemed colder than it should have for early September. The kind of chill that crept into bone and memory, stirring emotions. Fears. He believed he had been buried abroad, with his nose to the breeze and his tail swaying slowly. Thoughtfully, Ranger traversed the yard. He looked back at Luke every few minutes, as though he could feel the burden on his shoulders. The dog had incredibly keen instincts, perhaps even more so than Luke's own sense of peril. Ranger always understood when a turning point had come. After wiping the dust off his hands, Luke moved in the direction of the barn. He whispered, "Let's check it again," but he wasn't sure if he meant the dugout or his own determination. With his ears perked as if he were returning to a mission briefing, Ranger dropped in beside him at a pace that matched. The barn was colder inside than the home. The wind wormed its way through holes in the boards, bearing the aroma of northern pine and dried hay. Luke got down on his knees next to the shattered board, raised the lantern he had brought, and directed its light toward the gap. Beneath him, the dugout shone dimly. Silent, waiting, iron stove, wooden beams, and earth walls. The location exuded an odd aura, as though the earth had molded it to survive. Ranger leaned over the opening to see Luke as he descended the ladder once more. The chamber's air was significantly colder than it had been. However, it had a dryness that belonged in a room intended for warming rather than storage. After setting the lantern on the ground, he circled the room once more. No collapse, no mold. With the barn's wallboards protecting it, the vent pipe above appeared robust. The person who constructed this dugout did it with purpose. "Someone lived down here," Luke muttered, sliding his fingers along a packed dirt seam. The lamp flickered softly. Someone survived a winter like this. From above, Ranger whimpered, pleading with him to say something or do something. Anything but lose himself in the quiet. Luke sat on the upturned box, his breath hazy in the low light. He looked at the iron stove while wiping his palms against his pants. On a chilly night, he pictured giving it a handful of wood and seeing warmth fill this cramped, well-insulated chamber while the world. Above, it froze rigidly. How much wood would that require? 25% of what he needs in the cabin? A fifth, perhaps? Thoughts turned into calculations. He imagined the tiny stack currently sitting behind Jensen's house, the wood racks in town, and the rates written on the chalkboard outside his place. A month would not be long enough. Not with the winter that was hinted at in the forecast. This chamber is waiting, but has been forgotten. It's might be able to save him. Ranger might be saved by it. However, the men gathered at the general store, or Evan Mills would laugh even more when he told them about it. The insane veteran went underground and lived like a mole. He ultimately cracked due to PTSD. Luke put his hands together and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. It felt like a cold stone pressing down on him. He'd pushed hard to rebuild his life discreetly, away from commotion, away from the things that caused his breath to catch and his heart to race. The town calling him unstable was the last thing he needed. More than most others, he trusted Ranger. Above him, a slight breeze shook the barn siding. Winter was approaching, and it arrived to Montana in ferocious waves. He remembered evenings overseas when cold sliced through layers of gear, when frostbite followed exposed flesh, when men huddled in tiny shelters, wishing for something warmer than the surrounding sand and metal. He would not go through that again. Not in this place. No. Not with Ranger. Luke cautiously stood up and spun around to look around the room with fresh eyes. As a strategy, not a mystery. "We can make this work," he muttered. In response, Ranger pawed at the barn floor above him, his nails pounding the boards as if to give his assent. After climbing out of the opening, Luke got to his feet and cleaned his jeans of dirt. The wind kicked up again, hard enough to cause the walls to creak, and the light from the barn's lone hanging bulb wavered. The sky outside had turned a deeper shade of gray, suggesting an early freeze and possibly even some snow before Halloween. With a shudder, Luke tightened his coat. He glanced back and forth between the house and the barn. At the store, he recalled Evans laughing mockingly. Recalled the other men who were amusedly observing. Big mouths, little town. Until they didn't, they always had good intentions. Luke let out a deep breath and uttered the words aloud, grounding them in the chilly atmosphere. "We don't tell anyone." With a gentle snort, Ranger moved nearer and nudged his hand, cementing the deal like a second signature. Luke knelt down and briefly pressed his forehead against Ranger's. "Just until. We are certain it is effective. Until I'm certain it will keep us alive, that is." The dog gave him a gentle cheek lick. The same assurance that Ranger had previously given him prior to missions. With a feeling of determination in his chest, Luke stood up once more. He felt a steady, grounded determination that he hadn't had in years, instead of the frenzied, adrenaline-fueled urgency he'd experienced in conflict. He walked back into the barn, closed the. With doors behind him, he began gathering tools, reinforcing beams, upgrading the stove vent, adding insulation, strengthening the ladder, and preparing the dugout for the winter storm he knew was coming. Like an old protector of a new secret, Ranger lay at the edge of the aperture, keeping watch. Luke stopped and gave the dog a quick glance. "Let the neighbors laugh," he murmured. "When the winter strikes, we'll be ready." As Luke descended again, the lantern flashed beneath the barn floor, and the secret room greeted him with its unspoken promise. Comfort, security, and another chance to live through a season that had shattered stronger men than him. The first real breath of winter was announced above them as the wind pushed harder against the wooden walls. Luke stood in the midst of the dugout, candles spreading long shadows across the earth-packed walls. He could hear the faint echo of his own breath since the air was so calm. It was peculiar how a tiny, hidden location could feel more serene than the vast, open world above. Luke, however, was wise enough not to rely on initial impressions. Without reinforcement, safety didn't exist. He wouldn't risk either his own or Rurs's life on wishful thought. After placing the lamp on the ground, he removed his gloves and warmed his hands by rubbing them together. The floors he had not before spotted were exposed by the lantern's beam. There were small holes in the saw bricks, microscopic fissures in a few of the ceiling beams, and places where cold air leaked through the ventilation pipe. Every weakness would be discovered by winter. That was something he had discovered abroad. The weather was as merciless as any enemy. Luke ascended once more and came back carrying tools, 2 replacement beams, a hammer, and a handsaw. He had rescued a roll of heavy canvas he had taken up years ago for repairs, as well as items from the barn's rafters. From above, the ranger observed, methodically combing the flooring with his tail as though evaluating each movement. Luke responded, "All right, buddy," and lowered himself once more. "Let's create this space stronger." He began with the ceiling beams, reinforcing each one the way he'd been instructed to secure temporary shelters during cold weather operations. With the exception of the occasional creak of settling wood and the gentle, repetitive tap of the hammer, he worked in solitude. From the barn above, dust fell and drifted across the lantern's illumination like thin snowflakes. Luke's hammer caused Ranger to bark once. A little too forcefully, the sound reverberated strongly. Luke called and said, "I'm fine. Make a commitment." The dog was not completely calmed by the assurance. With his head bowed and his eyes fixed on Luke, Ranger stood watch at the opening's edge. Such loyalty was uncommon. Every time Luke looked into the dog's eyes during his darkest times abroad, he felt it deep down in his bones. Beside him, Ranger had been the only constant. And now that link was more important than ever in a Montana winter that threatened more than just discomfort. Luke went beside the walls, using clay scraped from the dugout's dry corners, and packed earth to fill in the spaces. Sweat formed on his brow despite the cold, and his breath clouded the air as he worked. Silently, the hours went by, the world above slipping into the darkness. With each renovation, the space began to feel more like a purposeful haven than a lost artifact. He felt a glimmer of confidence as he took a step back to look at the job. Small, but real. "That's better," he said as he turned to face the ventilation pipe, cleaning the dirt off its metal surface. It was sturdy but old, and the joints needed to be sealed. He covered parts of it with canvas and, after securing them with wire and verifying every connection, Ranger let out another sharp, quick bark. "Now what?" Hey, what happened?" Luke mumbled as he ascended the ladder and entered the barn, where Ranger was hobbling. Luke crouched alongside him, pulse constricting with unexpected terror. Rose's back paw was scratched, a little gash running through his fur. The dog moaned softly, pressing his head against Luke's shoulder in apology, as if he'd done something wrong. Luke exhaled, comfort washing over him. "You big knucklehead," he murmured, checking the paw carefully. "You wounded yourself on that loose board?" Ranger was heavier than he recalled, with years of strength from training and racing next to him. But Luke didn't mind the weight as he carefully scooped him and carried him toward the pile of old blankets in the barn corner. He sat on the hay bale and held Rose's paw in his hands. The wound was shallow but appeared painful, so Luke cleaned it with warm water from a thermos and wrapped a strip of cloth around it. Ranger let out a quiet huff and leaned into Luke's chest, bringing back memories of dusty nights when Ranger saved him from tripwires and the boyish smile of a fallen soldier, a moment Luke had spent years trying not to. Luke pushed back, concentrating on Rose's steady breathing. "You've always had my back," he whispered, "even when I didn't have my own." Ranger nudged his chin, understanding the emotion even without the words. Luke let the moment settle, then straightened. "We're okay, and we'll make. This place is okay too." He returned to work. Ranger is resting nearby, eyes half closed but still alert. Luke moved with a quiet urgency now, driven not only by survival but also by responsibility to the dog who trusted him with everything. He patched the ladder, reinforced the frame of the opening, and disguised the trapdoor with fresh hay from the loft. From above, no one would ever suspect a hidden chamber was beneath their feet. By the time he finished, night had. Luke knelt next to Ranger and caressed his fur. "That's it for today," he whispered. "Tomorrow, we make it livable." He let his hand rest on the dog's side, feeling the steady rise and fall of Rose's breath. Outside, the wind howled like a warning carried across the mountains, rattling the barn doors. Luke looked toward the sound, jaw tightening. Winter was approaching quickly, and from now on, the next few days went by in a blur of work as he and Ranger met it underground, alone, silent, and determined. Luke got up in the pale Montana sun, breathed in the bitterly cold air, and headed straight to the barn, while Ranger hobbled beside him, determined to protect every second of the project he saw as a mission. Luke respected that. The sky carried that washed-out blue that signaled the arrival of the first snow, and Luke could taste the change coming. He pushed harder, reinforcing the dugout walls, hauling blankets, old chairs and supplies down under the floor when the neighbors weren't around, and walking the property in the evenings. He saw himself more in stubborn loyalty than he liked to admit. On the fourth evening, just as the sun was setting behind the cottonwoods, Ranger stiffened, his ears snapped forward, and his whole body leaned toward the far end of the barn, toward the dirt road leading in from town. Luke followed the dog's gaze and saw a tall, broad shape that was too still to be a wanderer and too cunning to be. Evan Mills was lost. He wasn't exactly on Luke's property, but he was close enough to see the barn and wonder why Luke would spend every evening pacing around it and disappearing inside for hours. Luke kept his voice low, saying, "Let him pass." Ranger complied, but his growl was deep, low, and clearly protective. Evan raised a hand idly in a mock wave, then cupped his hands around his mouth. "Evening, Harrison. Are you fixing to move into that barn? You're in there more than your own house." Luke forced a nod. Casual but controlled. "Got repairs to make before winter." Evan chuckled and turned away, muttering something Luke couldn't quite hear. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked. Ranger didn't move until Evan disappeared down the road. Luke took her. That was too close, so he took a slow breath through his nose and covered the trap door with 2 layers of fresh hay the following morning. He even dragged an old wheelbarrow over the area to cover any footprints around the opening, but Ranger remained uncomfortable, standing above the trapdoor and staring at the barn door every time Luke descended. Barge in. Late one afternoon, as Luke was installing insulation behind the stove, Ranger let out a single, sharp, alert bark. It was a warning, not a cry of fear or panic, and it made Luke freeze. Every nerve in his body went limp, just like on patrols abroad. He placed the lantern on the ground, ascended the ladder in silence, and carefully made his way through the awkward opening. Ranger stood rigidly, his head turned toward the window slats high on the barn wall, his eyes fixed like a laser on something outside. Luke walked up to the wall, pushed aside a thin strip of old wood, and peered out to see Evan Mills standing behind his pickup truck, engine off, lights off, watching the barn, watching Luke's routine, watching for an answer to the question growing in Luke's mind. A knot formed in Luke's mind. Luke leaned forward and whispered, "Easy," as Ranger bared his teeth in a quiet snarl, his stomach tightening with each breath. "Don't give us away." But Evan wasn't stupid. He knew the signs of secrecy when he saw them. He'd watched Luke carry things toward the barn instead of the house. Watched him buy far less firewood than anyone else. Watched him pacing the yard with the tense posture of a man hiding something. And people, like Evan, didn't let go once they convinced themselves a mystery was brewing. Luke stepped away from the window and leaned against the beam, breath heavy. Ranger came to his side, nudging his hand with a soft, anxious sound. "I know," Luke whispered. "He's getting too curious." A memory washed over him. Dusty alleys overseas. A civilian whose innocent questions turned out not to be so innocent. The way suspicion once lit. Ranger refused to leave Luke's side that night. And even inside the cabin, the dog paced by the fire. He swallowed hard, pushing the tension down. He had promised himself he wouldn't let the past control him. But sometimes the past walked right up the road in a flannel jacket and stared through your barn walls. Hours later, when Luke dared to look again, Evan's truck was gone. But the uneasiness lingered. He's going to keep poking around, Luke muttered as he sat on the edge of his bed and rubbed his temples. Ranger whined softly and laid his head on Luke's thigh. We can't let him find the dugout. Not yet. If he does. Luke doubled down on secrecy the following day, moving supplies only at dawn or dusk, shoveling fresh snow around the barn door to conceal footprints, and training Ranger to stand watch at the back of the barn while he worked underground. Despite their best efforts to keep the secret safe, winter drew nearer. The air became sharper, and the wind whispered louder, and each night brought frost that crawled further across the fields. Secrecy was becoming harder, suspicion was becoming thicker, and Evan's shadow lingered just out of sight. One evening, as Luke climbed from the dugout and brushed the hay over the trapdoor, Ranger stepped forward suddenly, growling under his breath. Luke spun around. A silhouette stood in the falling dusk, motionless, only 20 yards from the barn. Not Evan this time. Another neighbor, watching, waiting. Luke's heartbeat thudded in his ears. People were starting to talk, starting to wonder, starting to notice. He tightened his grip on Rose's harness. From here on out, one wrong move could expose everything, and winter was only days away. The first snow didn't arrive gently. It came in a wall of white that swept across the valley like a beast awakened too early. One moment the ground was bare and brown one moment, it was buried under an inch of blowing powder the next. The wind roared down from the mountains with a force that rattled every loose board on Luke's property. By dawn, the radio crackled with updates about an Arctic blast rolling in. The announcer warned that it was the coldest front in almost 20 years, with temperature projections dropping with every hour. -10, 15, 20. Chainsaws buzzed. Firewood vanished from racks before the clerk could replenish them. Trucks hauled hay, propane, blankets, and anything else that could be carried. Luke didn't go to town because he couldn't, because if he returned with only a small amount of wood, someone would eventually follow him home. Instead, he stood on his porch with his arms crossed, watching the storm build in the west like a gray. The curtain is pulling toward him. Ranger pressed against his leg, tail stiff, eyes sharp as he studied the sky with instincts older than civilization. You feel it too, Luke murmured. A gust of wind struck hard, lifting snow off the roof and swirling it across the yard. The world seemed to exhale in one long, icy breath. By late afternoon, the temperature plunged so fast it felt like the air had weight. Luke's breath came out in thick clouds. Ranger paced in circles, restless. The cold bit at Luke's fingertips through his gloves, and he knew what that meant. Ranger, he said softly. It's time. They rushed toward the barn, boots and paws crunching through the new snow. As soon as Luke pulled the door open, the wind slammed it open, and he struggled to shut it behind them. The interior was dim, the air already much colder than usual. Ranger shook himself. Flecks of snow scattered as Luke swept the hay aside, raised the trapdoor, and lowered the lantern first. The lantern's glow illuminated the dugout below, and warmth, imagined warmth, hopeful warmth, seemed to radiate upward even before they descended. Luke carefully climbed down, and Ranger waited above until Luke reached the floor before jumping in with surprising grace for a dog his size. Luke closed the trapdoor and layered fresh hay on top. Down here, Luke knelt beside the stove and opened its small firebox door, feeding it a modest handful of wood from the bundle he'd hidden in the corner. The flames caught quickly, orange and lively, reflecting in Rose's eyes as he settled nearby. The storm's roar softened into a deep, distant hum, and the earth's natural insulation was muffled by the thick sod walls. As warmth began to push back the chill, Luke finally exhaled. Good. That's good. But relief didn't last long. A sudden crack echoed from somewhere above, followed by the heavy thud of snow collapsing from the barn roof. Ranger jumped to his feet, barking sharply. Luke steadied him, whispering reassurance. We're safe. It's just the storm. He hoped that was true. Hours went by, and the temperature inside the dugout increased gradually, from 45 to 50 to almost 57. Luke took off his coat and sat on the old crate, with his hands extended toward the stove, while Ranger curled at his feet and fell into a warm, contented sleep. However, above them, the world was in pain. Through the vent pipe, Luke heard faint, far-off sounds, such as doors slamming, cattle bawling, and the groan of frozen wood contracting under intense cold. Often the wind howled with a pitch so sharp it cut through the dugout walls like a blade. Luke thought of Evan Mill's kids, thought of the elderly couple 2 farms over, thought of the Jacobs family whose chimney had cracked last winter during a smaller storm than this. He thought of the soldiers he'd huddled with overseas, sharing heat, sharing hope, sharing fear. How silence had always carried the worst possibilities. Ranger's ears twitched as he lifted his head, sensing Luke's uneasiness. You're right, Luke whispered. There's nothing we can do. Not yet. He tried to fall asleep, but memories of chilly nights in distant mountains, nights when the wrong choice caused everything to freeze, and nights when the wind wasn't just a storm, but an enemy crept in. Ranger nudged Luke's arm every time his breathing faltered. Echo of the past. By morning, it was minus 25 degrees outside, inside the house. Luke knew that ice would be forming on the windows. In every other house in the valley, fires burned dangerously hot to keep people alive. Luke refilled the stove and warmed the water in the container. Before it froze, Ranger sat close enough to feel the heat but stayed vigilant, ears twitching. Every time the storm moved, Luke climbed the ladder toward the ceiling, opened the trapdoor a crack, and let the chilly air burn his face. The barn was dark and almost unrecognizable, with snow pressing hard against the walls and wind howling through every seam. He closed the door and secured it once more, saying to Ranger, "We're riding it out down here. It's the only way." Hours dragged by. The storm refused to weaken. Ranger dozed, woke, paced, and dozed again. Luke maintained the fire with meticulous, unceasing attention. He was proud of the dugout, of how warm it remained and how little fuel it consumed. But he wasn't proud of the nagging feeling inside of him, the one that whispered that others above ground were freezing. As night fell once more, the wind outside reached a pitch that forced Luke to stop. In mid-motion, he looked up and listened. Something had changed in that howl. Something sharper. Something other than weather. Rangers abruptly stood, their fur bristling. Then there were 3 faint knocks, barely audible but unmistakable. Luke's blood froze. Someone was outside. Someone who wasn't supposed to know. The storm had driven someone to his barn, and the secret he had fought so hard to protect was about to face its first test. Luke froze next to the stove, breathing heavily, as 3 soft raps carried through layers of earth and timber. He and Ranger locked eyes. Anyone was down here, desperate enough to walk through a minus 30 blizzard. Caught in his chest, Rose's ears snapped forward, his whole body taut as a drawn bowstring, and a low growl, warning rather than aggressive, vibrated through him. Luke looked up, his eyes fixed on the trapdoor. Snow hammering against the barn roof, the wind howling like a living thing. Whoever knocked must have been desperate. More desperate than. Whether it was pride, fear, or common sense, Ranger whimpered softly and nudged Luke's leg to get him to move. "I hear it," Luke whispered as he put down the stove poker and ascended the ladder, each rung cold beneath his hands. Ranger remained below, observing him intently, and when Luke pushed up on the trapdoor, a gust of icy air slapped him across the face, stealing his breath. The barn was dark except for the faint moonlight peeking through the boards. The knocking resumed, a little louder this time. Trembling with fear or cold, Luke took 3 long steps across the barn floor, his boots crunching over the thin layer of snow that had slipped in, and paused at the door, listening with his heart racing. "Who is it?" he shouted out. A hoarse voice answered, the horse trembling, barely heard above the wind. "Luke. It's Evan." Luke's gut tightened. Evan Mills, the same Evan who mocked him at the general store, the same Evan who'd been snooping around the barn, watching, judging, assuming the worst. Now he was outside in a storm that could kill a man in minutes. Luke unlatched the door and pulled it open. Snow burst inward like a living wave, coating the floor and stinging his face. In the blinding white stood Evan, hat gone, scarf frozen stiff around his neck, face pale except for windburn on his cheeks. His hands trembled uncontrollably inside thin gloves, and his breath came out in painful gasps. Behind him, a dark shape hunched in the snow. A child. Luke stepped forward immediately, gripping Evan by the arm and hauling him inside. The boy stumbled in after him, clinging to Evan's coat. He wasn't more than 7. His lips were turning blue. "What happened?" Luke insisted. Evan tried to balance himself by leaning on a beam. The furnace failed. "There is no more power." He shook violently, saying, "Firewood's almost gone. Kids got cold too quickly. I walked them to the barn. I saw your light. Thought maybe." Luke stared at him in disbelief. "You walked all the way here in this?" Evan tried to nod but shuddered instead, not knowing what else to do. Ranger rushed to the boy first, sniffing him urgently, then nudging him toward Luke. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's thick fur, trying to soak in his warmth. Luke's mind spun. The storm was worsening by the minute. Evan could barely stand. The boy might already be in mild hypothermia. And the house, their house, was a mile away. In whiteout conditions, they couldn't survive alone. There was only one place is warm enough. Luke clenched his jaw. The secret, the dugout. He'd promised himself he wouldn't reveal it until he knew it worked. But this wasn't about secrecy anymore. He made his decision. "Follow me," Luke ordered, grabbing the lantern. Evan stared at him. "Where?" "The barn's freezing." Luke didn't answer. He knelt beside the old hay pile, shoved it aside, and lifted the trapdoor. Warm light spilled upward, revealing the horror and perplexity on Evan's face. "What? What's that?" Evan asked, eyes wide. "Your best chance," Luke said. "Come on, bring the boy." Luke descended the ladder with the lantern. Ranger stayed at the top until the child stepped forward, then guided him gently toward the opening. The boy clutched Rur's neck, trusting the dog more than the storm. Evan followed, one trembling step at a time. When Evan reached the bottom, "You've been living down here?" "Staying warm," Luke replied. "That's all." Luke helped the boy sit next to the stove, wrapped him in 2 blankets, and checked his fingers and ears for frostbite. Ranger curled around him, providing the kind of warmth no heater could match. The boy pressed his face into Rur's fur, breathing more easily. Luke gave Evan a blanket and led him to the stove, saying, "Sit." Slow breaths. Warm up gradually. Evan collapsed onto the old crate, trembling, and looked around the room, taking in the stove, the walls, the supplies, and the smooth earth ceiling. "I thought you were hiding something dangerous," he said, his voice trembling, but didn't think it was this. Luke remained silent and threw another small piece of wood into the stove. Expanded through the room, gentle but undeniable. Evan looked up, guilt in his eyes. I shouldn't have judged you or followed you. I just heard his voice crack. I didn't want my kids to freeze. Luke paused, the weight of that sentence hitting him. The storm howled again above them, a violent, feral roar that shook the beams. The dugout held firm. Evan whispered, "How did you find this?" Luke said. "Ranger found it," and the dog raised his head, flicking his ears at the mention of his name. Evan gazed at the dog in awe, saying, "Smart animal." "The wisest," Luke said softly. Minutes passed. The storm raged. The dugout stayed warm. The boy whispered, "Mister, will we be all right?" Harrison Luke knelt beside him, met his frightened eyes, and said, "Yeah, I'm safe now." The promise was sealed as Ranger moved near to the infant. Luke allowed himself to breathe for the first time since the storm started. The secret had been revealed. However, it had prevented fatalities. And perhaps, just possibly, this was how things were always supposed to turn out. Nobody said anything for a long minute. The only sound in the trench was the crackling of the little iron furnace. Its soft gold was painted by flame on the densely packed dirt walls. The storm outside yelled on the barn roof, attempting to get inside. But the dugout remained sturdy, warm, and stable, unaffected by the mayhem above. Only a dog could provide the youngster with the kind of warmth that Ranger did when he lay against him. He wrapped his body over the child's side in a protective manner. The boy's breathing had evened out and his shaking had slowed. The color was coming back to his cheeks. Evan's eyes were wide with exhaustion as he observed everything, his breathing still trembling but less forcefully than before. After being beaten and stripped of his pride by the storm, he was finally able to see what Luke had been concealing. His voice was rough as he glanced up at Luke. What is this location?" Luke took a while to respond. He placed the kettle on top of the burner after filling it earlier. The slight sizzle of hot metal disturbed the silence. With 3 people and a dog inside, the dugout didn't feel crowded, but it did feel smaller. It had a sense of security. Luke said softly, "This room's been here a long time. Years before I bought this place, maybe decades." Evan traced the smooth, compacted soil with his fingers along the closest wall, saying, "It's solid, warmer than most houses right now." "That's the concept," Luke replied. "How'd you find it?" Evan shook his head slowly, saying, "I thought you were losing it, Harrison. I thought you were hiding something illegal or worse." His voice dimmed in shame. "I followed you because," Luke said, glancing at Ranger. The dog flicked an ear at the mention of his name, but did not move from his guard post beside the boy. "I didn't understand." Luke watched as his expression changed from fear to gratitude, suspicion crumbling under the weight of reality. The kettle started to steam, and Luke filled a metal cup with warm water and powdered broth before giving it to Evan. Evan wrapped his trembling fingers around the cup and took a slow sip, releasing a breath he had been holding for too long. Luke didn't flinch. He'd heard worse from people he trusted more, but something inside him softened, not toward Evan's words but toward what they represented. Desperation had stripped Evan down to honesty. "It's all right," Luke said. "You were scared." "I'm sorry, Luke." He swallowed hard. "Everyone is afraid in." Evan nodded, awake but with heavy eyes. "But how long have you been using this? Storms like this?" "Why did you keep it a secret?" "Because I didn't know if it would work," Luke said, taking a slow breath. Evan put his palm on the burner and said, "I needed to test it, to be sure." People don't listen unless they see something with their own eyes. And what do you think they'd have done if I'd told the whole town right after finding it? Evan didn't hesitate. Evan looked away, embarrassed once more. Luke leaned back, his voice quieter now, saying, "When you've lived the things I've lived, you get cautious about what you share. Some things you keep quiet until you know they're real. Until you know they'll help." Luke nodded, eyes drifting toward the boy who was now dozing against Rurs's warm fur. That's what counts. Evan looked around the room once more, taking in the stove, the beams, and the small vent that carried smoke through the barn wall without anyone noticing. This place, it's genius. Luke remarked, "I didn't build it. Someone before me did. Someone who knew how to survive the cold. Whoever they were, they saved my family tonight," Evan whispered. The storm above crashed violently, shaking loose snow from the rafters. Evan's eyes widened as he finally realized something more profound. How warm does it stay? For real? Luke raised the old thermometer he'd hung next to the stove, and the needle hovered around 58. With this stove, a handful of wood lasts hours, maybe longer. Evan let out a long, slow breath. "My wife and kids have been wearing jackets inside the house since November. We've been burning everything we can find, and it's still cold. That's why I kept it quiet," Luke said. "I needed to know it could keep someone through a real storm." Evan looked up sharply. "It's doing more than that. It's saving us." Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. Minutes passed. The boy murmured something into Rear's fur. The dog pressed even closer, eyes soft, guarding him with all the weight of his training and all the love he carried for Luke. At last, Evan muttered, "Luke, may I ask you a question?" "Yes." "Will you share this with anyone else?" Luke didn't answer right away. He stared into the stove's glow, watching the small flame dance. He had been ready to protect the secret for months, years if he had to. But looking at Evan's son, remembering nights overseas when shelter meant life or death, something shifted in him. "If this winter keeps up," Luke said slowly. Evan nodded, relief in his eyes. "I might not have a choice." "Good. Because some people out there won't make it through many more nights like this." Luke looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time, Evan didn't look like a man passing judgment on him from a distance. Instead, he looked like a neighbor. Like a father who was afraid for his kids. Like someone Luke could finally relate to. Evan swallowed again, his emotion thickening. His voice. "Luke, thank you for taking us in. For saving my boy." Luke shook his head. "Thank you, Ranger. He's the one who heard you first." Evan turned to the dog and gave him a long, grateful stare. "Then thank you, Ranger." Ranger thumped his tail once solemnly, like he accepted the responsibility. Luke leaned back against the earthen wall. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the soldier he once was. Someone who protected others and made things better. Above them, the storm raged on. But down here, truth had finally been revealed, and that truth would soon ripple far beyond this small hidden room. He didn't just survive tonight. He helped someone else survive too. The storm raged through the night with a violence neither man nor beast could ignore. Luke barely slept, checking the stove every hour, feeding it small pieces of wood, watching the flame rise and fall like the faint heartbeat of their survival. Ranger stayed awake longer than either of them, ears twitching at every blast of wind overhead, his eyes reflecting the firelight like two amber beacons. By dawn, the wind still screamed, angry and unrelenting. The dugout remained warm, at 60. But the outside world was frozen solid. Evan stirred on the crate, moaning as he sat up. His son slept curled up next to Ranger, the dog's chin covering the boy's shoulder. Luke silently observed the scene. Snow piled against the barn walls so thickly that the vent pipe above them groaned under the weight of the drifts pushing in. Evan rubbed his eyes. "How long was I out?" "Most of the night," Luke said. Something about the way Ranger guarded the child, steady, gentle, selfless, struck deeper than words could reach. He continued. Storm persisted. Evan nodded while continuing to survey the entire space. "Feels like we're in another world down here." Before Luke could speak, a faint sound came from above, muted but unmistakable. Another knock. Evan tensed up. Luke walked halfway up the ladder and slightly opened the trapdoor to listen. "Someone else?" he said. Ranger immediately stood up, his head cocked and his body tight. Once more, the knock was more forceful and desperate. Then a faint, desperate voice. "Hi. Is there anyone inside? Please assist." Luke's heart began to race. The voice was not that of a man. It was a female. He climbed into the barn after forcing the trap door open. Through every seam, frost blew in. He was punched by the cold. In a matter of seconds, he made his way across the barn and opened the door against the wind. 3 people staggered in. Despite being draped in 2 blankets, Evan's wife Karen, their teenage daughter Emily, and their youngest boy, trembling wildly. Karen's eyelashes were frosted, and her face was almost white. Emily's eyes were red from windburn as she gripped her younger brother. The youngest tried and failed to breathe normally as she cried into her side. Luke took hold of Karen's arm. Now, inside. With the snow whirling around them like enraged spirits, the 3 ran inside. Luke closed the door and slammed it shut. Breathless, Karen fell against a beam. The house, it had got too chilly. The fire would go out. I was unable to. Fear shattered her voice. There was nowhere else I could go. Emily chattered her teeth. Dad promised to see how Mr. Harrison was doing. We assumed Luke had prevented her from finishing when he failed to return. He's secure. He's downstairs. The trap door was opened by him. Like a gift, warm air ascended. From below, the ranger urged them down with a bark. Karen noticed the bright light underneath the floor and gasped. Luke exclaimed, "Your shelter." "What is that?" "Hurry." Ranger ascended 2 rungs to assist in guiding the youngest child down, gently pressing him onto the ladder. Emily trailed behind, holding the blanket firmly across her shoulders as Luke assisted Karen in going down. Evan stood when they got to the bottom and spotted his family, his eyes widening. Karen. Emily. God, what took place? Sobbing into his chest, Karen threw her arms around him. We were dangerously close to missing it. Evan gave her a firm hug before turning to face Luke while crying. Luke nodded, his throat constricted. Thank you. Thank you for opening that door. However, it wasn't finished yet. Ranger moved between the kids as they settled in, examining each one from nose to cheek to make sure none were in danger. He lay down, letting the youngest lad curl against him, wrapping. He surrounded them as if he were a living blanket. Thankful for the warmth, the adolescent also laid her back against the dog. Incredulous, Evan shook his head. 10 people could live down here, he muttered. Luke corrected him, grinning a little. We can keep everyone warm for the time being, though maybe not 10. Karen slowly scanned her surroundings. This place is amazing. Firm, warm, and secure. Luke squatted next to the stove and fed it another little block of wood. Heating doesn't require much. That's the idea. Suddenly, whispered voices of relief, emotion, and disbelief filled the room. The dugout briefly became a haven instead of a place to hide. However, another sensation developed as warmth permeated numb, frigid fingers and toes. Also, I hope Karen dabbed at her eyes. "How long does it stay this warm, Luke?" He replied, "And we don't waste wood, as long as I feed the stove." She nodded, tears threatening once more. Luke sat back and gazed into the flames on the stove, saying, "Thank you for saving my children. He has already saved soldiers. He would." Saving a neighbor's family during a Montana blizzard seemed different, closer and more personal than protecting strangers abroad. Evan sat silently next to him. "We owe you everything, Luke." Luke remained silent. Rather, he turned to face Ranger, who was laid out on the dirt floor. Children around him like a warm stone surrounded by fallen leaves. "That dog," Evan muttered, "might be the reason we're still breathing." "He is," answered Luke. Time went by. There was a tiny softening of the storm above. Not enough to travel, but enough to notice a change in its melody. Wrapped in a blanket, Emily leaned against the wall and observed Luke with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Mr. Harrison, did you build this?" "No," Luke replied. "It was done by someone before me. I just corrected it." "And you kept it secret?" she asked gently. Luke nodded after a moment of hesitation. "Up to now." Emily gave a slow nod. "I appreciate that you didn't keep it a secret tonight." Luke looked down. Certain secrets are not designed to remain hidden. Not in times of need. Evan put a solid, appreciative hand on Luke's shoulder. "When it mattered, you came to our aid. That is something I will never forget." Luke took a deep breath. "Just make sure your family is warm. That's all that counts." There was a lengthy, quiet hush in the room, the kind that only occurs when fear lets go. The kids were asleep. Karen rested her head on Evan's shoulder. Emily observed Ranger's breathing. Luke warmed his hands while sitting next to the stove, letting the moment's weight settle deep within him. Tonight, Dugout had saved a family. It may need to save more tomorrow. Luke was fully aware of what that implied. The secret was not simply revealed. Now it was alive, shifting from one set of eyes to another, expanding, growing, and biding its time until the valley as a whole needed it. For now, though, 10 individuals breathed warm air in an 8-foot space while the storm outside ripped at. The entire world. Luke Harrison, who had previously been a solitary veteran with a secret haven, had transformed into a lifeline. The dugout was more than just a refuge by the time the storm started to lessen its intensity. Beneath a frozen, stiff world, it had become a little, pulsing heart of warmth. The stove gave a soft crackle. The kids curled up next to Ranger, his. A warm body covered them as if it were a living blanket. With tired tears drying on their faces, Evan and Karen reclined against the wall, their heads touching. With her hand on Rose's back, Emily fell asleep, trusting him in the same way that people trust objects that have saved their lives. Luke stayed up the longest. With his elbows resting on his knees, he sat close to the stove and gazed calmly into the blaze. His mind was free of old recollections for the first time in years. It wasn't battling ghosts or shadows. He wasn't reliving things he wished he had forgotten. It was here, with a reason. The storm shouted less loudly outside. Its voice broke, then subsided into deep groans. Snow still packed against the barn walls in heavy drifts, but the wind had softened from a ferocious howl to a weary sigh. The cold was still harsh by late morning, but it was manageable. The dugout's thermometer maintained a constant reading of 58. As the family gradually awoke, Luke filled tin cups with warm water and distributed them. Staring in shock at the steam rising from his cup, Evan rubbed his freezing hands together. "I'm still not sure how this operates." Luke gestured toward the walls. "In storms like this, Earth provides more insulation than both wood and masonry. The person who discovered this was really skilled at what they were doing. Karen gave a head shake. It seems unattainable. It feels like we're sitting by a bonfire while under a hurricane's eye. Emily let out a trembling breath. It seems miraculous. Sensing the change in mood, Ranger gave a single tail wag. Luke got up and stretched. The storm is dying. We'll go up after it settles. However, they haven't yet ascended. Not until the outside walls were no longer being torn apart by the blizzard. Not until the wind finally let forth a final sigh and fell silent. Later, when Luke unlocked the trapdoors, a wall-like blast of chilly air hit him. His boots sank nearly to his knees in the snow as he got out. Half of the barn was underground. The windows were covered in frost. Under the frost, every beam moaned. Wait. Squeezing through next to him, Ranger quickly scanned the yard, nose buried in the snow. White vapors blew out of his mouth. Luke pivoted and extended his hand to assist the family in ascending. They came out, blinking in the intense light. Stay close, Luke cautioned. He opened the barn doors with a push. A dense, heavy sheet of snow fell downward. A mountain of white met them, level with the barn roof. In some places, the globe had changed into a frozen desert and was no longer recognizable. Karen gave a gasp. "Oh my lord," Evan said. Luke didn't argue. "We would have died last night." The ice itself bore the truth. Luke used his boots to help carve a small path as they went from the barn toward the home. Ranger leaped forward, creating tunnels in the children's snow. They no longer felt as though death was breathing down their necks despite the frost biting at their cheeks. Inside and out, the windows at the Mills residence were covered in layers of frost. When Evan pushed open the front door, it moaned. The interior air was colder than both the outside and the barn. Emily chattered her teeth. "This is where we resided." Luke remained silent. He entered and looked over the furnace. It was solid frozen. The firewood pile nearly gone. Evan wasn't lying. They have been operating on fumes. Karen clung to her youngest. "Until this warms up, we must remain with Luke." Evan gave a nod. Everything had frozen, including pride. Luke's throat was cleaned. "You are allowed to remain in the dugout while we make repairs. First, we'll survive the remainder of the cold weather." With thankful eyes, Karen took hold of his hand. "Thank you, Luke. We were saved by you." He only nodded, unsure of how to react. By nightfall, Luke and the family went back to the dugout. With a satisfied sense of duty, the ranger trotted behind them, wagging his tail. The storm moved on. Word got out the following day. Although the Mills family had no intention of speaking, neighbors noticed the damage to their furnace and asked how they survived the storm. The truth slipped out in pieces. Luke Harrison's barn has a secret area beneath it that uses a little portion of the wood and is as warm as a hearth. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Awe replaced curiosity. 3 neighbors traveled to Luke's land in less than a day, their hats pulled low and their eyes straining from the cold as they trudged through knee-deep snow. Luke emerged from the barn while they reached out. Ranger's was a silent shadow at his side. "Morning," Luke said. The oldest rancher in the valley, Mr. Garrison, cleared his throat and said, "Luke, we heard you got some kind of underground heater. Something that saved the Mills family." Luke remained silent and waited. Mrs. Rogers then moved forward, her face burned with worry. "Our firewood's half gone already. The furnace is acting up too. If this cold keeps up, we won't last 2 more nights." Another neighbor spoke. "We aren't asking for charity, we just want to see it." "What you built down there?" Luke hesitated. Revealing the dugout meant losing the last bit of secrecy he had. It meant inviting questions, crowds, maybe even ridicule from those who didn't understand. But then Ranger nudged his leg softly just once. It was enough. Luke exhaled. "Come with me." He led them to the barn. The neighbors gasped. "What in the world? This is unbelievable. How did you find it?" Luke replied simply, "Ranger found it. I fixed it. You're welcome to look." They descended the ladder slowly and reverently, as if entering a hallowed space, their faces glowing with wonder at the temperature. For the first time in his life, Luke Harrison had something to offer that wasn't strength, fighting, or sacrifice on a battlefield far from home. Mr. Garrison shook his head. Craftsmanship. The simplicity. This could save the entire valley. You understand that, son? Luke looked at Ranger, loyal, watchful, and proud. Then at the neighbors, cold, tired, and desperate. "Yes," he said, "I do. Warmth, knowledge, and the will to share it." Ranger leaned against his leg again, sealing the moment. Luke finally smiled. "Let's get you all through the winter." Word traveled through the valley faster than the next storm. Families who had never spoken more than a polite nod to Luke now trudged up the snowy path to his barn. Boots caked in frost, breath fogging the air. They arrived with questions, with fear, with hope shining in tired eyes. And Luke, quiet, steady. Luke met each of them with the same answer. "Come on, I'll show you." Ranger led every group, padding across the barn floor with the calm assurance of a seasoned guide. When Luke lifted the trapdoor, warmth rose from the earth like a promise. People gasped, marveled, and wiped their eyes as they descended into the 8-foot chamber that had once belonged only to Luke and Ranger. Now it belonged to everyone. The following weeks unfolded like Luke taught ranchers how to pack sod earth, reinforce beams, and conceal vent pipes so that no snowdrift could choke them. He taught mothers how to bank a stove so that heat would last through the night. He taught teenagers how to measure soil moisture and patch cracks in dugout walls, and Ranger was by Luke's side every day, watching, guiding, warming shivering hands with his fur, leaning against frightened children until they stopped trembling. One morning, Luke found Rangers standing proudly with a group of kids, shepherding them away from a weak patch of ground where they'd been trying to dig. Luke knelt, checked the soil, and realized Ranger had just prevented a small cave-in. "Here's something else," Luke whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Winter deepened. The temperature dropped below what anyone could recall in decades. However, nobody in the valley froze. Nobody burnt the last piece of furniture. Nobody pondered if they would see daylight as the frost crawled across their walls. Everything had altered because of Luke's dugout. 7 brand new dugouts, each constructed under Luke's supervision and powered by tiny burners that consumed a modest amount of regular fuel, were dispersed across the valley by late January. Families congregated underneath to exchange. Long breaths of relief, stories, and food. Before it was ready for use, Luke stood inside each one, inspecting the walls, testing the ventilation, and running his hands along the beams in the same manner as a military inspects a shelter in a dangerous area. Every dugout was also examined by the Ranger, ears attentive for anything strange, nose twitching. Although the valley had previously withstood storms, none of them were as severe as this one. Harmony. When February arrived, a remarkable event took place. People began discussing how warm the valley felt instead of how chilly the winter was. Luke didn't look for attention. He didn't deliver speeches or stand in front of large groups. He just worked quietly and steadily, just as he had overcome every obstacle life had presented. But the valley saw, the valley knew, and the valley decided he deserved more than quiet gratitude. The whole population congregated in the town park at the end of winter, as the snowbanks began to soften with the first signs of spring. a piece of open space with snow-dusted benches and leafless aspens all around. The sunset cast a soft gold tint across the sky. The air was hazy with breaths, yet nobody shuddered. Unaware of the reason for their visit, Luke came late with the ranger by his side. However, he came to a halt as soon as he entered the clearing. Everyone was present. With their coats wrapped around them, the Mills family stood in front, grinning through tears. Behind them, a tiny wooden platform constructed overnight was surrounded by ranchers, store owners, and families Luke had assisted. Evan moved to the front. "We wanted to thank you, Luke." Luke trembled. His head. "You're not required to." Karen whispered, "We do. We were saved by you. Everybody." The audience muttered in agreement. Evan picked up a little wooden plaque made of barnwood that had been salvaged. "There are no medals here. The military is not who we are. But this is what we wanted to give you." He gave Luke the plaque. It read Luke Harrison for kindness, bravery, and the warmth that kept us alive. Luke took a deep breath. Words became lodged in his throat. His hands shook a little, not from cold, but from the pressure of being noticed, comprehended, and valued. Ranger gave him a leg nudge. Evan chuckled quietly, and we remembered him. Karen moved forward carrying a smaller, smooth, sanded plaque with a bronze nameplate that resembled the silhouette of a dog. Ranger for bravery and dedication. Warm applause broke out from the audience. Kids rushed to Ranger and gave him hugs, pats, and expressions of gratitude. Ranger appeared to accept his job with quiet dignity as he stood tall and proud, his tail wagging softly. Luke blinked multiple times, attempting to control the surge of emotion that was filling his chest. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a sense of relief. It was a sense of belonging. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years. The sheriff spoke up. "I believe we can all agree on one thing, folks. Without Luke and his dog, this winter would have been fatal. Because they stood up for us, this valley will stand from now on." Warm waves of applause swept across the clearing. Overwhelmed, Luke bent his head. He glanced at Ranger, who returned his gaze with serene golden eyes. The identical eyes that had often warned, led, and saved him. Luke put his hand on the dog's head. He muttered, "Couldn't have done any of this without you." Leaning against him, Ranger accepted the compliment with the same uncomplicated elegance. The valley celebrated not only surviving winter, but also enduring it together as the sun set behind the mountains, creating long shadows across the snow. Warmth rose from the throng like a flame as Luke stood in the center of them with the ranger by his side. Luke didn't feel like the man running away from his past for the first time in a long time. He had the impression of a guy creating a future. In the future, everyone would have access to warmth rather than it being concealed beneath the floors. If you feel something in this narrative, make a simple comment, perhaps just one or 0. So I am aware that you stayed with us all the way through. In addition to helping this channel expand, your remark indicates that you would like to see more stories like this. In order to avoid missing the upcoming episode in our trip, please make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. More devoted dogs, more veterans, and more tales of bravery, optimism, and second chances. I'll see you at the next nameplate.